Hey everybody, welcome back. This is part A of the fashion inventory problems as part of module 2. So hopefully at this point you read the problem synopsis and went over the coding style guide a little bit. Don't worry if you're not able to remember everything from the coding style guide. With a lot of things in this module, again, it's not necessarily the end-all be-all. It's not as though this is the only style guide you'll ever need or you'll ever want to consult. It's much more along the lines of style guides are a thing. Here is an example of one that you should be able to follow. And if you follow it, you should be able to produce more, let's call it consistent code. So for all of these problems, we have this same big array of objects. And so it's a current inventory. It has two objects, one here for Brunello Cucinelli. If I'm saying that wrong, well, I'm saying that wrong then. And this is for Gucci. So essentially what we're going to be doing is all of the functions for this section are going to be taking this as our input, and it's going to be doing various things to this. Now for part A, we're going to write a function that takes in this current inventory array as its argument. It should access all the shoes across each designer and print them out in a flat list. So here's an example of a flat list, and essentially, let's have a look at this in the console. That'll be a good place to start. So if we, when logged to the console, these forward slash, is it forward? Yeah, forwards. You want to look at where the top of the slash is pointing. That's how, excuse me, that's how I came to remember it. If the top of the slash is pointing backwards, it's a backslash. The top of the slash is pointing forward, it's a forward slash. Hopefully I don't have that backwards because I really remember it cleanly that way. Anyway, so these new line symbols are essentially going to mean, hey, console, instead of putting whatever I have in the rest of the string on the same line, move to a new line before you do anything else. And so as you can see, it's done that for all of these. So we can print out first line, second line, and third line. So cool, so that's what a flat list is. So eventually we're going to have all of the information from our current inventory array in this flat list. So let's close the console and observe that a flat list refers to a string. Also note that the flat list ends with a new line symbol. This did not used to be the case. I actually changed this yesterday because I was noticing that it might be asking too much in this question to ask you to do what we're asking you to do, but also remember to not put a new line symbol on the last one, or after the last string is added. So that may or may not be a good idea, but that is the idea we're going with. There are tests attached to this, so you can run this with just the render inventory function, but again, for a lot of these problems, we're getting used to the idea of testing, getting ourselves familiar with assertion functions, creating a test suite with code in the same place, and then running everything and making sure that it works. So let's go ahead and do what we've been doing. We're going to grab all of this, come over to a replit, and I've kind of cheated a little bit here. There are actually a couple things that I decided to put in here already, so you don't have to continue watching me type them out, let's say slowly. So if render inventory, as it says, is going to return a flat list is a string, and it says hint the return value is a string. If I have a function that's returning a string, that's a scalar value, which means that I'm going to be able to make use of my assert equal function, which I've actually already written, and I've also already written out the entire output string as it should appear. So now that we have both of these, we'll go ahead and move them up. So assertion function, there's my assertion function. And a couple calls to the assertion function are going to be coming here. So we'll say variable expected flat list is equal to that. And let's put it above. We'll say variable actual flat list is equal to, and this is going to be the actual call to our function. So we'll say render inventory. And we're going to need to call render inventory on something, which is where we're going to bring in our last variable, which is the actual current inventory. We need this over there as well. So we'll copy this, bring it over, and I think this should go below here, because these are going to be test cases down here. So the first thing I'll want is a variable to use in the test case, and then a call to the render inventory function using current inventory. Sorry, passing in current inventory for actual flat list. And then we're going to make a call to assert equal. So assert equal is going to take in, again, 3 parameters, or 3 arguments when we call it. So parameters for the definition, arguments for when you call it. And the first argument, because it's where we're calling it, is actual flat list. Second one's going to be expected flat list. And our test name here is where test names become a little bit, let's say, imprecise. I don't mean to say that we necessarily need to write an imprecise test name. I mean that what we're what we're doing here doesn't necessarily have the same kind of reasoning behind it that the categorical reasoning that we applied to something like, I think there was a function that we did earlier where it was like you square a number. So it's like, can it square a integer? Can it square a negative? Well, I guess an integer would be a negative or positive, but can it square a 0? Can it square a decimal? For this, we don't really have a bunch of other categories to apply. It's mainly, can it do the thing that it's supposed to? So we'll say something like should render flat list of inventory items, which is, not a wonderful test name, but it will get the job done because we're really only going to run one test. You could run more tests, but for our purposes, the function is going to return a string, so we'll just make sure that the string that comes back is what it should look like. So now that we have our test going, this is our expected flat list, and here's our call to assert equal. Everything should be good. So from here, we can actually jump up to render inventory and start working on the function. So if you think about it, render inventory is taking in this inventory parameter, which is essentially this array of objects down here. So if that's the case, and we're going to return a flat list, we'll need to create a flat list. So we'll say create a flat list string. And then at the very end of this function, we're going to return that flat list. Now, ordinarily, we've done a thing where we are writing out all of the pseudocode first, or the pseudocode is written out for us first, and then we fill in the code as we go. But one of the things that a lot of students complain about, justifiably, is that it's not always easy to solve a problem like that. In fact, sometimes it's impossible because you don't really know what you're supposed to be doing at this point. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of put some pseudocode and then a little bit of code and then get things running so we can test the output of our function just to make sure that everything is going appropriately. So flat list is going to be equal to an empty string. At the very end, we're going to return that flat list. Now, if we have a situation where the inventory is an array of 2 objects, I would like to have a look at those 2 objects, which means that I'd like to iterate over them. So we're going to iterate over the inventory. So if we iterate over the inventory, I'm going to use a for loop to do that. ++, and we can find the keys. There we go. And here's where it might be kind of like, okay, well now what? Which is an excellent question. So what I would say is, let's just have a look at what we have. So if we're iterating over the inventory, let's see what the inventory looks like at each iteration. So let's scroll down here and make sure that what we're doing is actually going to be appropriate. We're going to see some problems if we leave this running. So we'll comment this out. The function running here should do everything that we need it to do. If we run the function here and we have a console.log inside of the function when it's called, the output should give us a good idea of what inventory at I is. So let's run. Undefined. That is not necessarily what we were looking for. And it might have something to do with the fact that we spelled length with a rather mix and match approach to spelling. So let's make that inventory.length and check for any other obvious errors. Don't see any. Let's hit run again. Excellent. So it looks like we have, well, we're not really that much closer if you just look at this. So let's give ourselves a little bit of a hint. We'll say something like current inventory. We'll put that in quotes, and then we'll run this again. And this might give us a nice label. So okay, so current inventory is name, Bruno Cucinelli, and then a shoes and a bunch of arrays, or sorry, a shoes and then an array of a bunch of objects, and then same thing for Gucci. So what we're looking for is to grab this name and add that plus this and this to a string. So what you could picture is that it looks like each one of these objects at inventory at I is essentially an object for a designer. So we could say something like variable designer object is equal to inventory at I. The only thing that this is going to do is give us an easier way to identify inventory at I. So if we have the designer object, we know we can grab the name because the name is just going to be designer object.name. And we'll verify that by console.logging it. And that's desinger, which is not the same as designer. Desinger object is not defined. Oh, well, probably should have just left it because I spelled it wrong both places. Bruno Cucinelli and Gucci. So for each one of those, we're going to want to add a bunch of names and prices for each shoe. So here's where some more pseudocode would come in handy. So we'll say, for each shoe in the designer objects shoe array, we're going to want to add the designer name, the shoe name, and the shoe price, and the new line symbol. Now I know that that's kind of coming out of left field, but you figure that each one of these strings that we're creating, at the end of it is going to have a new line symbol. We scroll down here and we look, we add the designer name, the name of the current shoe, the price of that current shoe, and then a new line symbol. And then we do the same thing for the next shoe in the list, still with Bruno Cucinelli as the first part of the string. So for each shoe in the designer object shoe array, add the designer name, the shoe name, and the shoe price, and the new line. Now it turns out that that's just about it. We've pretty much done everything that we would need to reason about. So for each shoe, there's two ways that we can do this. One would be to create another variable alias, which is to say shoes array is going to be equal to designer object, and again we're saying desinger, which is not what we should say. Designer object, which is another vote of confidence for copying and pasting things, because I spelled object wrong there as well. Shoes array is equal to designer object.shoes, because designer object.shoes is actually going to give us that entire array. We're going to prove it, and I know that this might seem a little bit verbose, but this is one of those where you might not do this during the interview, but you might do it a lot while you're just working on problems. Just make sure that as you're iterating, what you think is going to happen is going to happen. And as we look, there's the shoes array for each one of those. So with that in mind, all we're going to do is create a for loop that goes over that. So first things first, let's get rid of our console.log. Then we're going to create another for loop. This one's going to be using j. So variable j is equal to 0. J is going to be less than, and it's like we could say inventory at I dot shoes dot length or shoes array dot length. That's why we're doing those aliases. Shoes array dot length, j plus plus. And we're going to wrap this around the pseudocode. You don't have to. In fact, that can be a rate limiting step for some people where they find that to be a difficult process to engage in. So you don't need to, but it can be helpful to make sure that your pseudocode lines up. And the reason is that if you get to the end of the function and you run it and it doesn't work, reasoning about the code that you wrote is actually quite difficult, whereas reasoning about the pseudocode that you wrote can give you kind of like a lattice work to climb back up or down, depending on which way you think you were going in the first place. So which is to say that when you run the code, if it works, but the answer isn't correct, you might want something to do other than just look at the code. And for that, we would compare the code with the pseudocode, and then if that doesn't work, we compare the pseudocode with what we think should happen. So at this point, we want to add the designer name, the shoe name, and the shoe price, and the new line. And again, this is all going to be added to flat list. So the designer name is just going to be designer object.name. So let's start with flat list plus equals, and we'll say designer object dot name. And let's scroll down here and take note of something real quick. We have the name, and then added to that we have a comma and a space, and the same thing between the shoe name and the shoe price, a comma and a space. So we'll just keep that in mind. Designer object dot name plus quotes, comma and a space, plus the shoe name. So this one could be shoes array. I think there was something in the style guide about not calling shoes array shoes, or not calling something shoes array. You don't really want to put array in there. So let's follow that and we'll just say shoes instead. I kind of like saying shoes array and sort of disagree with that, but that's okay. So we'll say shoes array, or sorry, we'll say shoes instead of shoes array. So for shoes, we'll be shoes at j. And now we're already starting to notice that the shoes array, shoes at j question is starting to be annoying. So what we'll do is we'll do another alias. We're going to say current shoe. And we're going to set that equal to shoes at j. That way we don't really have to worry about the index variable. We'll just talk about the current shoe. So if we have a current shoe, and the current shoe is an object, and we want the price, we'll say current shoe dot price. However, we don't want the price, we want the name. And we want the price in a moment. Plus a comma and a space, plus current shoe dot price, plus, and you might be thinking, hey, isn't this a number? This is one of those moments where JavaScript is going to help us out. It's actually going to know that we want that number to be part of a string, because we've added a string to a string to a string and then a number. It's going to be like, hey, I think you probably want this in as a string, so here it is. Were that not to be the case, you might want to run something like toString here, which would change it into a string explicitly. But for our purposes, we're going to leave that out because we don't need it. Current shoe.price plus, and then the last thing in this list, if you look down, here's the price of a shoe, is this new line symbol. And then we would start again with the next name, and that's going to happen during the next iteration. So if we scroll back up here, current shoe.price plus, and then we'll throw in our new line symbol, but it's got to be inside of quotes. If it's not going to register as what it ought to. So let's think about it. Create a flat list string, check. That's the last time we're going to do that check thing. That can be annoying. Iterate over the inventory, for variable I is equal to 0, I is inventory line. Okay, cool. I'm not sure which would be better, cool or check. Anyway. Variable designer object, so we're creating an alias for the current level of iteration on the inventory. Then we're creating an alias for the designer object.shoes, which is going to be just shoes, and then we're going to iterate over that shoes array. So for variable j is equal to 0, j is less than shoes at length, looking good. Variable current shoe is equal to shoes at j, another alias, which is just going to make it easier to access what we want. Flat list plus equals, so we're adding to our flat list the name of the designer object, which is part of this iteration, and then the current shoe, which is part of this iteration, current shoe name, current shoe price, and our new line symbol. So if we've done everything correctly, this should be adding everything that we need to our flat list and then outputting it correctly. So there's really a couple ways for us to find this out. One is to console.log the actual flat list first and see if it looks like it ought to. But what I would say is let's just comment out our assert equal function, where we actually compare actual flat list with expected flat list. If we get passed when we call assert equal, then it looks like we're going to be in good shape. Now you might notice, hey, create helper functions if needed. Maybe we just didn't need them. Theoretically, we could create helper functions. And once you learn more about higher order functions, you're going to realize that there is a completely different way to approach a problem like this. But for now, we're not going to worry about that at all. You might consider, as a bonus exercise, trying to create a helper function that creates this flat list, or that adds to this flat list. Perhaps instead of all of this here, we just have a function like this. It would say flat list plus equals render current shoe string, and then call that with designer. We'll call that basically with all of this. So designer object.name, current shoe.name, and current shoe.price. We would then write another function down here called render current shoe string, which essentially just does this. And now that I say that out loud, we'll do that in a moment. So I'm going to leave that commented out there just for a moment. And let's first make sure that the first function that we wrote is correct. So if we hit run, we see passed. So we have correctly written this function as it ought to look. Now, let's see what we can do in terms of creating another. Should we do this right now? Yeah, why not? So at this point, you could consider that the function is correct. We'll go ahead and copy everything. Bring it back over here. Paste it on in. Wow, there's a lot of extra lines down there. That's okay. And run our tests. Excellent. So it renders the inventory properly. So you could end the video here if you would like to, but let's go back and talk about how we might break out a small portion of this into a different function. So flat list plus equals designer object.name. So instead of this, we're going to make this into this line here. We want flat list plus equals render current shoe string on these items. Object current shoe.name and current shoe.price. And we've reached the unplanned part of this video, so if things go haywire, that's okay, we'll fix them. So now that we have a function called render current shoe string that we're using in here, this is called wishful programming. We assume that we can write a function that does this. So what we'll do is we're going to need to create a function called render current shoe string. Render current shoe string's return value is going to be basically this right here. So if that's the case, I'm going to copy that, put it down here as a comment. Render shoe string is going to take 3 parameters, a designer name, which is going to be used for this, a shoe name, and a shoe price. And it looks like what we want to do is we want to return designer name plus a comma and a space plus shoe name plus a comma and a space plus shoe price plus our new line. We can get rid of this comment because it's not really helping us anymore. And that should be it. Now, there might be an issue with scoping where we did this incorrectly, but I think that this should be right because at this point what we've done now is replaced our flat list plus equals designer object name and did all of that operation inside of our other function and just separated that to a separate function. Render current shoestring takes in 3 parameters and lines them up this way as this function describes. So now that we have all this going, let's run and see if we have broken anything. And we haven't. So this works as well. So that's what they mean by helper functions. The idea would be that if you get to a point where you can clearly state, hey, this is something that we could probably move to another function, you might want to do it. Now, we're starting to get to that section of things where the right answer is not necessarily what you're going for. It's much more, do you have a justifiable explanation and understanding of why you're choosing the option that you did? That's kind of going to be what we're moving towards for all of this. So it's a good idea to get practice with it. So, hope you enjoyed this video. You should be able to get all of this from the reference answers and solutions in terms of the actual answer, but I hope you enjoyed the walkthrough. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.